"Sir, why doesn't your son play with anyone?" Jude Mercer felt the world stop turning. People said he'd once ordered an entire operation wiped out without blinking. People said the whole Chicago underworld trembled at the sound of his name. But right now, right outside the school gates, in the middle of a relentless downpour, he stood frozen in place before a little girl who didn't even reach his waist. An old sweater worn thin at the shoulders, a cheap floral skirt, wrinkled and rumpled, sneakers with the toes split open. In her right hand, she held a red balloon that jumped and tugged in the wind. But her eyes, those eyes looked straight at him, straight through the black suit, straight through the untouchable shell he'd spent a lifetime building, straight through the underground empire no one dared lay a hand on. He opened his mouth. He couldn't get a single word out, because she didn't stop at that question. She kept talking, and what she said was something he, as a father, should have known a long time ago. His son, an 8-year-old child carrying a deadly illness inside his small body, didn't cry because of the sickness. He cried because of a guilt he believed belonged to him, a guilt heavy enough to crush a grown man. And he carried it alone, for 8 months, in silence. And Jude, the most powerful boss in Chicago, hadn't known a thing. Not until a little girl selling balloons stood outside the fence and saw what his entire world had chosen to look past. If this story touched you, hit like so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded it's never too late to change. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be the one you need to hear. 3 weeks earlier, the black Escalade stopped in front of the gates of Westbrook Academy at 7:58 in the morning, like every day, precise to the second. Jude Mercer couldn't tolerate lateness, not even a single minute. In his world, being 1 minute late could cost a life. Brennan sat behind the wheel, his eyes sweeping both sides of the street with the reflexes of a man who'd spent 15 years living among bullets and blades. Jude sat in the back seat, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and slow, like each word was a knife slicing through the air. "Tell Calloway if he touches the shipment at the Southport one more time, I'll send him back in a container box. Don't make me say it a third time." He ended the call and turned to the seat beside him. Oliver sat there, a backpack far too big for his thin frame, his eyes fixed on the car window. The 8-year-old said nothing. He didn't say, "I'm going to school, Dad." He didn't say, "Pick me up this afternoon." He didn't say anything at all, as if language had been drained from his body a long time ago. "Oliver, remember to take your medicine on time," Jude said, his voice harsher than he meant it to be. The boy didn't respond. The door opened. A soft click. Oliver stepped out, his backpack dragging along the ground, his small back disappearing into the stream of students. Jude watched through the tinted glass. His son was thinner than last month, paler, his steps heavier. Catherine had once said, "You look, but you don't see." Back then, he thought she meant his work. Now he understood she'd meant their child. The phone rang. Brennan glanced at the rearview mirror. Jude answered. The Escalade pulled away, and the chance to say one more sentence to his son slipped past again, like every morning, like every day for the past 8 months. Recess at Westbrook Academy was as loud as any school in the world. Laughter, shouting, the slap of shoes against concrete. But there was one place that was always quiet, the stone bench beneath the old oak tree in the eastern corner of the yard. Oliver Mercer sat there every day, in the same spot, in the same posture, so often that the wood had been worn smooth beneath him. He opened his book but didn't read. His eyes rested on the page, as if searching for something that had been lost long ago. On the back of his left hand, the bruise from the chemotherapy needle hadn't faded yet. He tugged his sleeve down to cover it, a small habit no one noticed. No one came near him, not because he was mean or strange, but because everyone knew who his father was. The teachers knew, the parents knew, and the children had heard enough whispers at home to understand they should stay away from Jude Mercer's son. 300 meters away, outside the school gates, a different world was unfolding on the sidewalk. Elise Dawson pushed her balloon cart past the corner of Michigan Avenue at 7:30 in the morning, when the Chicago wind cut into her face like a blade. Her hands were cracked, even though she rubbed cheap lotion on them every night. Her jacket was thin, the zipper broken on one side, held together with a safety pin, but her smile was always ready when customers appeared. $2 for a balloon. On her best day ever, she sold 30. On her worst, 5. $800 a month for rent on a 25-square-meter studio on the south side. She did the math every night before sleep. And every night the answer was the same: not enough. Phoebe sat on a small folding chair beside the balloon cart, her legs wrapped in a wool scarf instead of socks, because the last pair had torn the day before. The 6-year-old drew pictures with crayons worn down to half their length, drawing big houses with wide yards she'd never lived in. Elise watched her daughter and remembered how these same hands, 6 years earlier, had turned the pages of law textbooks at Northwestern. A full scholarship. A wide-open future. Then 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test erased everything. Deal with it or disappear. Don't disgrace my family. Those were the last words Phoebe's father said to her, tossed together with a stack of cash on the table like payment for a mistake. Elise chose to keep her child. She lost the scholarship. She was cut off from her family. For 6 years, she worked every job she could find: waitress, dishwasher, maid, cleaner. Selling balloons was the only job that let her keep Phoebe beside her, because she couldn't afford daycare, because there was no one else in the world but the 2 of them. Every night, Elise split the meal into 2 portions. The larger one went to Phoebe. The smaller she packed away and said, "Mom's already eaten." Some nights she slept with an empty stomach, but Phoebe never knew they were poor, because Elise turned everything into a game. Walking instead of taking the bus was an adventure. Instant noodles were a princess feast, and balloons were a kingdom in the sky. But Phoebe wasn't foolish. She saw more than her mother thought. From her folding chair outside the school gates, Phoebe looked through the iron fence into the yard. Every day, the same image. A skinny boy sitting alone under the oak tree, opening a book without reading, staring into empty space as if waiting for someone who would never come. "Mom, why does that boy always sit by himself?" Phoebe asked one morning, her eyes still fixed on the fence. "It's not our business," Elise replied, her hands pumping balloons without stopping. "But he's really sad, Mom." Phoebe turned to her, her wide eyes serious in a way that felt unsettling. "Sad like when you think I'm asleep and you cry." Elise froze. Her hand holding the pump stopped mid-motion. Her daughter had seen everything. The nights she cried in the dark, the meals she pretended to finish, the moments she stared at the mirror and didn't recognize herself. Phoebe saw it all, and now she was looking through the fence at a stranger, at a boy she didn't know, and recognizing the same pain she'd seen on her mother's face every night. 3 days after that morning, Phoebe was still sitting on the folding chair beside the balloon cart, but her eyes no longer dropped to her sketchbook. Her gaze clung to the iron fence, clung to the small, skinny shadow sitting beneath the old oak tree at every recess. She counted. 3 days, 3 mornings, 3 recesses, and that boy didn't speak to anyone, didn't smile even once, didn't lift his head from the book he never actually read. Elise watched her daughter and recognized that look. She'd seen it when Phoebe was 3, when she found a stray cat with a broken leg in the alley behind their building, and she held it for 2 full days, refusing to let go until it could crawl away on its own. The same look, the same gentle stubbornness Elise both loved and feared. At noon on Wednesday, the Chicago air felt colder than usual. The delivery truck that brought the balloons was parked at the end of the street, nearly 200 meters from Elise's cart. This week's shipment was late, and the driver had texted that she'd have to come get it herself, because he couldn't park close to the school. Elise looked at Phoebe, looked at the balloon cart, then looked down the street. 200 meters. 5 minutes there, 5 minutes back. "Sit here. Don't go anywhere. I'll run and pick it up and I'll be right back." Phoebe nodded obediently, too obediently. Elise should have noticed that. She turned her back and hurried toward the end of the street. Phoebe waited exactly 10 seconds. Then she stood up from the folding chair, stepped to the balloon cart, and tilted her chin up at the dozens of balloons bouncing in the wind. Her eyes stopped on one. A red balloon. The biggest, the roundest. A fierce red, like fire against Chicago's gray sky. The most beautiful balloon on the cart. The one her mother always saved because it sold for $3 instead of 2. $3. The price of a dinner. The price of a cup of noodles with 2 eggs. The price of the way her mother pretended to be full every night. Phoebe knew it all. And still she lifted her hand, unhooked the red balloon from its string, gripped it tight, and turned and ran toward the school gate. The gate was open. Recess. Parents coming and going. No one noticed a 6-year-old girl in a worn dress slipping through a gap in the iron gate, a red balloon in her hand, sprinting headlong across the noisy concrete yard. Phoebe's heart hammered. She'd never been inside the fence before. Inside was different. The yard was bigger than she'd imagined. The grass was greener than she'd imagined, and everything was clean, bright, and perfect in a way that made the torn toes of her shoes feel heavier than usual on this ground. But she didn't stop. She ran straight to the stone bench beneath the oak tree. Oliver was there, like every day, his book open on his lap, his eyes fixed on the page. He didn't look up even as small footsteps rushed toward him, not until a shadow fell across the paper. Oliver lifted his head. In front of him stood a stranger, her hair a little messy, her cheeks red from running, her breathing ragged, and in her hand, a red balloon bobbed softly in the wind. "This is for you," Phoebe panted, her voice still catching. "My mom says when you're sad, you should look up at the sky. Balloons fly really high. Sadness can fly up with them." Oliver stared at the balloon, then at the girl, then back at the balloon. His lips moved. No sound came out. His eyes, tired eyes ringed with the dark shadows of sleepless nights and chemotherapy drips, suddenly sparked with something. He reached out and took the balloon string, a thin, pale hand, the bruise on the back of it still not faded. His fingers trembled as they touched the string, as if it had been a long time since anyone had given him anything that wasn't medicine, wasn't a needle, wasn't a pitying look. No one had given him something simply because they wanted him to feel happy. The red balloon danced above the two children. The schoolyard stayed loud all around them. But beneath the old oak, time stopped for a few seconds. A little girl from outside the fence was standing inside the fence. A boy who spoke to no one was looking at someone for the first time in 8 months. "Little girl, you're not a student here." A teacher's voice cut through the moment like a blade, sharp and urgent. "Who let you in? Get out, now." Phoebe flinched. Her eyes flashed in panic at the teacher running toward her, then back to Oliver. The boy looked at her, his hand clenched around the balloon string as if he was afraid someone would snatch it away. Phoebe turned and ran. Small feet skimmed over the grass, slipped through the iron gate, and shot back toward the balloon cart. The red balloon stayed behind, in Oliver's hand. He watched her tiny back vanish through the gate, then lifted his eyes to the balloon bobbing above his head, red blazing against the gray sky. For the first time in 8 months, something like hope flickered across the boy's face. Small, fragile, but real. Elise returned 5 minutes later with a bag of new balloons in her arms. She counted the cart. Counted again. One was missing, the red one. She looked down at Phoebe sitting on the folding chair, eyes lowered to her sketchbook, drawing an enormous red balloon against a blue sky. "Phoebe." Elise's voice trembled. "Where's the red balloon?" The girl didn't look up. The crayon kept moving across the paper. "I gave it to him." "What did you do?" Elise dropped to her knees, both hands gripping her daughter's shoulders. "Do you know that balloon is $3? $3 is dinner for us. It's 2 eggs and a cup of noodles. It's what I have to stand in the wind for 2 hours to sell." Her voice wasn't angry. Her voice was tired. Tired in the way of someone who was used to counting every coin just to make it through the day, and suddenly losing $3 without warning. Phoebe looked up. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but not because she was afraid of being scolded. "Mom, he needs it more than we do." Her voice was tiny, but steady as a stone. "No one gives him balloons. He doesn't have anyone. Not anyone at all." Elise stared at her daughter. 6 years old. 6 years old. Speaking like someone who'd lived 100 years. Elise wanted to be angry. She wanted to explain that $3 mattered more than Phoebe thought. That the world inside that fence wasn't a place for the two of them. That kindness didn't pay rent, but she couldn't say it. Because in Phoebe's eyes, Elise saw herself 20 years earlier, back when she still believed love was enough to change everything. She pulled her daughter into her arms, breathed in the familiar scent of her hair, and whispered, "Don't go in there again, sweetheart. I'm begging you." Phoebe kept her promise to her mother. She didn't sneak through the school gate again, but Phoebe was Elise's daughter. And if Elise had once been stubborn enough to keep the child in her belly when the whole world told her to get rid of it, then Phoebe had inherited that same stubbornness, only she used it in her own way. On the first day after the red balloon, Phoebe sat on the folding chair and looked through the iron fence during recess. Oliver was on the stone bench beneath the oak tree as always, but something was different. His right hand held the string of the red balloon, the balloon a little smaller than the day before because it had leaked some air, yet he kept it beside him the entire recess, resting it on his lap, as if it were the most precious gift he'd ever been given. Phoebe saw that. smiled, then bent down and tore a small piece of paper from her sketchbook. With a crayon, she drew quickly a huge smiling face, 2 round dots for eyes, a curved mouth, so simple it was almost silly, and yet strangely warm. Then she walked to the fence, knelt, and slipped the paper through a gap in the iron bars. The scrap landed inside the fence on the green grass, about 10 steps from Oliver's bench. She didn't know if he would notice it. She didn't know if he would pick it up. But the next morning, when Phoebe looked through the fence, the scrap was gone. After that, it became a ritual. Every morning, before Elise could notice, Phoebe would sneak to the fence again. Some days she slid through a little drawing of the sun. Some days it was a cat. Some days it was a house with 2 people standing in front of the door, one tall and one short, and she didn't even know who she was drawing. And some days, when Elise was busy talking to customers, Phoebe unhooked the smallest balloon on the cart, the cheapest one, and tied it to the fence bar with a double string, so it would bounce in the wind right where Oliver passed every recess. Oliver didn't say anything, but each day he changed a little, so slightly that only someone watching closely could see it. On the 3rd day, he didn't walk straight to the bench anymore. He veered first toward the eastern fence. He only passed by, as if by accident, but his eyes flicked down to the grass, searching for the paper, and when he saw it, his steps slowed by half a beat. On the 5th day, he stopped at the fence. He picked up the scrap with the butterfly that Phoebe had slipped through that morning. He stared at it for a long time. Then he tucked it into his pocket. On the 7th day, he didn't veer off anymore. He walked straight to the fence. He sat down on the grass inside, his back against the iron bars, and outside the fence, separated from him by a thin line of metal, Phoebe sat down too, her back against the bars on the other side. The 2 children sat back to back, separated by a fence, not speaking, just sitting there, in a silence that was somehow warmer than any conversation. Then, on a Friday at noon, when the Chicago wind finally paused and rare sunlight spilled across the schoolyard, Oliver turned his head. His lips moved, and through the gaps in the iron, the voice of an 8-year-old boy came out, so quiet that if the wind had blown a little harder, it would have been lost. "Thank you for the balloon." 4 words. The first 4 words Oliver Mercer had spoken to an outsider in 8 months. Not to a doctor, not to a nanny, not to his father, but to a 6-year-old girl sitting outside the fence, her hands smudged with crayon, her feet wrapped in a wool scarf instead of socks. Phoebe didn't answer. She only smiled. Then she slipped another scrap of paper through the bars. This time she drew 2 people, one big and one small, holding hands beneath a red balloon so large it filled half the page. That afternoon, when they packed up the balloon cart to go home, Phoebe ran to her mother, her eyes shining. "Mom, Oliver talked to me. He said thank you." Elise's hands went still. She looked at her daughter. She felt her chest go warm and sharp at the same time. Her little girl had done what no one else could, pulled a sentence out of the silent boy on the other side of the fence. But at the same time, the familiar fear crawled up Elise's spine. She looked at the school gate, at the luxury cars lined up to pick children up, at the mothers in expensive coats, glancing toward her balloon cart with the look Elise knew too well. "Phoebe, listen to me." Elise knelt down and held her daughter by the shoulders. "If they see you bothering the students here, they'll kick me out. Losing this spot means losing our home. Do you understand? Losing our home." Phoebe went quiet. Her lower lip trembled, but she nodded. That night, the 2 of them lay on the narrow bed in their cramped studio, and in the dark Phoebe whispered, "Mom, but Oliver is lonelier than we are." Elise didn't answer. She only held her child tighter, eyes wide open to the ceiling, and wondered when her 6-year-old daughter had started carrying other people's pain on her own small shoulders. 2 weeks after the night Phoebe whispered in the dark, on the day the Chicago rain came down as if someone had torn the sky open, everything changed. Elise was struggling with the tarp over the balloon cart when Phoebe disappeared from the folding chair. Elise turned around. The chair was empty. Her heart clenched. Her eyes swept along the sidewalk, past the school gate, and she saw her daughter standing in front of a tall man in a black suit beneath the awning at the entrance. Jude Mercer. Elise recognized him instantly, because who in this neighborhood didn't recognize the black Escalade and the man the whole street whispered about? She ran through the rain, letting the tarp fall, balloons jerking wildly in the wind. But when she reached them, she saw Jude Mercer standing perfectly still, his face drained white, his eyes fixed on Phoebe and yet seeing nothing at all, as if the little girl had just driven a knife straight through his chest with her words. "I'm sorry, sir, I'm sorry." Elise grabbed Phoebe's hand and yanked her behind her. "She's just a child. She doesn't know anything. She made it up. I'm sorry. I'll tell her. What did she say?" Jude cut her off, his voice raw and rasping, as if someone had squeezed his throat and then let go. "She doesn't know anything, sir. She's just—" "Say it again." He didn't look at Elise. His eyes stayed locked on Phoebe. "Say it again for me, what you just said." Phoebe stood behind her mother, but she wasn't afraid. She looked up at the man 3 times her size, eyes wide, her voice small but each word clear. "I sit outside the fence every day. I hear Oliver talk," he said. "Because I screamed in the car, Mom turned around to look at me. Mom didn't see that other car. Because of me, Mom died. Rain fell, wind blew, traffic on Michigan Avenue kept moving. But Jude Mercer didn't hear any of it anymore. His ears rang. The world shrank until there was only the tiny voice of a 6-year-old echoing over and over inside his head. Because I screamed in the car." Oliver thought he'd killed his mother. His son, 8 years old, carrying a disease that ate at his body every day, sitting alone at every recess beneath the oak, silent for 8 months, not because he was shy, not because he was sick, but because he believed his screaming in the car that day had killed his mother. Because Catherine had turned to look at him. Because Catherine had been distracted. Because that other vehicle had come crashing in, and the 8-year-old had tied it all together into a rope and hung it around his own neck. Because of me. Because of me. Because of me. Elise said something. Another apology. She pulled Phoebe away, but Jude didn't hear her. He stood there in the rain, arms slack at his sides, eyes staring into the empty air ahead, and inside his head another film began to play. 8 months earlier, a Tuesday afternoon, Catherine drove Oliver to his regular appointment at Northwestern Hospital. Jude should have gone with them. Catherine had texted, "I need you to come today. Oliver is terrified of needles." But Jude had a meeting with partners from Detroit, a $3 million shipment, not something he could postpone. "Take the nanny," he texted back. Catherine didn't reply. She drove herself. Oliver was in the back seat, crying because he was afraid of the needle, screaming, kicking the seat. Catherine turned to soothe him, and the black SUV behind them sped up and forced Catherine's car into the median. The police called it a traffic accident, a chain collision, bad luck. But Brennan dug deeper. The black SUV belonged to one of Frank Calloway's men, the same man who'd been fighting Jude for territory for 2 years. It wasn't an accident. It was a hit. A warning. A message written in blood and sent straight to Jude Mercer, saying no one near him would ever be safe. Catherine died at the scene. The last face she saw was her son's in the rearview mirror. Oliver sat in the back seat, the seatbelt keeping him alive, only a few scratches on his forehead. But the real wound wasn't on his skin. His eyes were wide open, watching his mother slump over the steering wheel, watching blood, watching shattered glass. And inside the mind of an 8-year-old child, the story rewrote itself into the simplest version, the most painful version. I screamed. Mom turned around. The car hit us. Mom died. Because of me. He didn't know about Calloway. He didn't know about the black SUV hired to kill. He didn't know that even if he'd sat silent as an angel in that car, Catherine still would have died. Because it hadn't been an accident. It had been a death sentence the underworld signed on his mother's behalf. And Jude knew the truth. He knew Catherine died because of him, because of the empire he'd built with blood and fear, because of the enemies he'd made in 15 years of ruling Chicago's underground. He knew it. And he buried that truth deep inside, packed anger over it, pressed work down on top of it, built distance between himself and his son, so he wouldn't have to look into Oliver's eyes and see his own guilt reflected back. But he'd never known his son was burying a truth too. A different truth. A truth an 8-year-old had woven out of a horrific memory, condemning himself, punishing himself with silence, with loneliness, with refusing to live. Father and son, the same pain, 2 different truths, and neither of them knew the other's truth. Jude stood in the Chicago rain, water streaming down his face, and he didn't know if it was rain or tears. He only knew that a 6-year-old balloon seller outside the fence had just seen what he, the father, the most powerful man in this city, had been blind to for 8 months. His son was dying, not from leukemia, but from guilt. That night, Jude Mercer rode home without remembering the way. Brennan was behind the wheel, glancing at the rearview mirror more than once, but he didn't dare open his mouth. His boss sat in the back seat, eyes open and seeing nothing, hands still on his thighs, like a man whose soul had just been pulled out of his body. The Mercer mansion sat on a hill on the north side of Chicago. 12 bedrooms, 4 floors, grounds as wide as the entire apartment complex where Elise lived. But when Jude stepped through the door, the silence crashed down on him like concrete. No laughter, no voices, only the wall clock ticking, and the nanny's heels moving softly along the second-floor hallway. "Where's Oliver?" Jude asked, his voice rough. The nanny stopped, a little startled, because the master of the house rarely asked about the boy at this hour. "He's in his room. He's had dinner. At least, he sat at the table." Sat at the table, not ate. Jude nodded and went upstairs. Each step felt heavy as lead. The second-floor corridor was long and dim, night lights casting a faint yellow wash over the walls. He passed the master bedroom, where half the closet still held Catherine's clothes untouched, where her perfume bottle still stood on the dusty vanity. He didn't stop. He went straight to the end of the hall, where Oliver's bedroom door stayed shut, like every night for the past 8 months. His hand settled on the doorknob. For the first time in months, he turned it. The door opened, and the room's smell hit Jude in the face. Cold. Not the cold of air conditioning, but the cold of a room without the warmth of someone truly living inside it. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the streetlights beyond the window. Darkness lay thick, except for the weak glow of the star-shaped night lamp on the bedside table, the one Catherine had bought for Oliver when he was 4. The bed was made with unnatural neatness, the nanny's work every day, white sheets, pillows flattened smooth, perfect as a hotel room. But inside that perfection, Oliver lay curled in the corner of the bed, small, folded in on himself, as if he were trying to take up as little space as possible in this world. His arms were wrapped tight around a framed photo pressed to his chest. Jude didn't need to look to know whose face was inside it. And looped around the boy's right wrist was the string from the red balloon. The balloon nearly deflated now, wrinkled and limp, but he held on to it the way someone held on to life. Jude stood there, watching his son sleep, and the pain in his chest was so sharp he had to brace his shoulder against the doorframe. Then he saw it. Under the bed, where the darkness was thickest, something stuck out. The corner of a piece of paper. He knelt, reached under the bed, and pulled it out. Not one page, dozens, stacked together, wrinkled, corners folded, as if someone shoved them into hiding every time a person came into the room. Jude switched on the desk lamp. Yellow light spilled over the pages, and his world cracked open. The first drawing showed a car wrecked beyond recognition. Black crayon had split the body of the car in 2. Red crayon showed something spilling from the door. Blood. An 8-year-old drawing blood in red crayon. The second showed a woman. Long hair, a white dress, wings growing from her back, rising into the air, her face tilted downward, mouth open, eyes sad. Catherine. His son had drawn his mother as an angel, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the same variation. The winged woman flying higher and higher, farther and farther away, and below, in the corner of the paper, a little boy, tiny, standing alone. Darkness closing in, the boy grew smaller with each drawing, as if he were shrinking, vanishing, erasing himself from the world. Jude turned each page with trembling hands. Every drawing was the same, the sky above with the winged woman, the darkness below with the boy alone. No one else in the picture. No father, no friends, no one at all, only the boy in the dark. Then Jude reached the last page. This one was different. No car, no blood, only a sentence, written in pencil, the letters shaky and slanted, the handwriting of an 8-year-old trying to write straight, but unable, because his hand was shaking too hard. "Mom, I'm sorry I screamed in the car. I'll be quiet forever. Please come back." Jude read it. Read it again. Read it a 3rd time. Then he collapsed to the floor, his back against the side of his son's bed. The drawings scattered around him like shards of a world he'd never known existed under his own roof. He lifted a hand to cover his mouth, not to hold back sobs, but to hold back a scream. Jude didn't know how long he sat on the floor of Oliver's room. When he finally stood, His knees cracked, and the star-shaped nightlight had dimmed as if its batteries were dying. He looked at his son one last time, the boy still curled around Catherine's photo, the red balloon string looped around his wrist, his chest rising and falling softly in a sleep Jude didn't know was peaceful or full of nightmares. He closed the door gently, walked down the dark hallway, and instead of turning into the master bedroom, he went down to the first floor, into the study, and locked the door behind him. 3 a.m. The mansion was silent as a grave. Jude lowered himself into the leather chair behind his desk, opened the bottom drawer on the left, the drawer he'd locked the day Catherine died and hadn't opened once since. Inside was a cardboard box. He set it on the desk, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Catherine's wedding ring, the pearl earrings she'd worn on Oliver's birthday, the thin wool scarf she wrapped around her neck whenever the weather turned cold, still faintly carrying the scent of jasmine, and her phone. Jude picked up the phone. It felt heavier than he remembered, or maybe his hands were weaker than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. He plugged it in. He waited. After a few minutes, the screen lit up. The wallpaper, a photo of Oliver grinning wide, one front tooth missing. Sunlight poured over his face. Jude couldn't remember the last time his son had smiled like that. He opened the voice messages. There were 37 unheard messages. 37. He scrolled, searching by date, and stopped at one sent 3 weeks before Catherine died. 2 minutes and 43 seconds long. Catherine had sent it at 11 at night. He remembered that night. He'd been at the West Side warehouse with Brennan, checking a shipment from Detroit. The phone rang. He saw Catherine's name on the screen, and he silenced it, not because he didn't love her, but because in his world, work was always more urgent, always more important, always unable to wait. Catherine could wait. Catherine always waited, until there was no time left. Jude pressed play, and Catherine's voice filled the room. Jude. Her voice was soft, a little hoarse. The voice of someone who'd cried, and only then hit record. I know you're busy. You're always busy. But I need to tell you something. Silence. A breath. Then she continued. Oliver asked me a question today. He looked at me with eyes older than he is and said, Mom, why is Dad never home? Does Dad do bad things, Mom? He's only 8, Jude. 8, and he sees everything. He sees strange men guarding the house. He sees Brennan carrying a gun under his coat. He hears you on the phone with that voice nobody ever wants to hear. A longer silence. Jude heard Catherine swallow. I want to take Oliver away from here. The sentence dropped like a hammer. I've been thinking about it for months. I can't sleep. I'm scared, Jude. Not scared of you. Scared of the world you've dragged our family into. Every time an unfamiliar car parks by the gate, I hold Oliver and run into the back room. Every time you come home late with blood on your hands and you tell me it's just a nosebleed, I pretend to believe you. But I can't pretend anymore. Catherine's voice shook. But I love you. And I'm afraid if I say this, you'll think I'm betraying you. You'll think I'm trying to take Oliver away from you. I don't want that. I just want our child to be safe. I just want to sleep one night without jolting awake because of a sound at the door. Silence. Long. Jude thought the message was over. But Catherine added one last line. Call me back when you're free. If you're free. The message ended. 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Shorter than a song. Longer than his whole life. Jude sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the phone screen that had gone dark again, reflecting his face back at him. The face of a man who hadn't called her back. Not once. Not ever. 3 weeks after that message, Catherine drove Oliver to his appointment, alone, because Jude was busy, and Calloway's black SUV had been waiting. Catherine didn't leave, not because she didn't want to, but because she loved him, because she was afraid of betraying him, because she chose to stay, to endure, to hope he would change, and because she stayed, she died. Catherine didn't die only because of Calloway. Catherine died because she loved Jude Mercer. That truth burned him from the inside out. The whiskey glass on the desk flew across the room, slammed into the wall, and shattered. Liquor ran down the wall like blood, and the sound that tore out of Jude's throat filled the night. Not a human sound, but the howl of a wounded animal. A howl he'd never made in 15 years of ruling Chicago's underworld. A howl he didn't know he was still capable of making. He howled for Catherine. He howled for Oliver. He howled for every call he didn't answer. Every dinner he missed. Every time he chose work over family. Every time he looked and didn't see. Heard and didn't understand. Loved and didn't know how to hold on. Upstairs, Oliver startled awake. He lay still in the dark, eyes wide, listening to the howl rising from below, cutting through the floor, through the walls, through bone. He knew it was his father. He wanted to run downstairs. He wanted to ask what was wrong. He wanted to say, "Dad, I'm here." But he didn't move. He lay still, pulled the blanket up over his ears, clutched Catherine's photo tight to his chest, and closed his eyes. Because he'd learned long ago, 8 months earlier, on the day his mother slumped over the steering wheel and his father didn't cry at the funeral, that grown-ups preferred to hurt alone. Grown-ups didn't need children. Grown-ups didn't need anyone at all. So he would hurt alone too, like his father, like all the grown-ups in the world. Father and son, under the same roof, one floor apart, one man howling in the dark, one boy silent in the dark, and neither of them went to the other. 3 days after the night the howl rang through the Mercer mansion, the black Escalade stopped about 20 meters from Elise Dawson's balloon cart on the Michigan Avenue sidewalk. But this time it wasn't outside the school gates. This time it was late afternoon, when Elise was pumping the last balloons of the day, her hands flushed red from the cold, her breath warming her fingers between each squeeze of the pump. Phoebe sat on the folding chair, drawing a winged cat on the final scrap of paper in her sketchbook. Elise saw the black Escalade first. Then she saw Brennan step out from the driver's seat. The large man in a black coat leaned against the front of the vehicle, arms crossed, eyes scanning the area with professional instinct. And even though he wasn't looking directly at Elise, his presence carried enough weight that the stretch of sidewalk suddenly felt emptier, pedestrians unconsciously drifting away. Elise's heart tightened. She knew who Brennan was. The whole neighborhood knew. The shadow that always walked beside Jude Mercer, the eyes that never smiled, the hand that always stayed hidden beneath his coat. She looked at Phoebe, and her first instinct was to scoop her up and run. They were here because of Phoebe, because she'd slipped into the school, because of the red balloon, because she'd spoken to the boss's son. Elise had known this day would come. She pulled Phoebe behind her, straightened her spine, lifted her chin. If she had to face them, she would face them standing tall. Then the rear door of the Escalade opened. Jude Mercer stepped out, and Elise almost didn't recognize him. The man in front of her didn't look like the boss the whole street whispered about. The black suit was still a black suit, but it was more rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. Deep shadows sat under his eyes, his jaw rough with unshaven stubble, his gaze hollow and bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 nights, or like a man who had slept, but woke inside a nightmare every time he closed his eyes. "Miss Dawson?" His voice was rougher than it had been the last time, when he'd stood under the school awning in the rain. Elise swallowed. "If you're here because of my daughter, I've already warned her. She won't go into the school anymore. She won't talk to your son anymore. I will. I came to thank you." Elise stopped in the middle of the sentence. Her mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. She stared at him, then at Brennan beside the car, then back at him again. "Thank you." The Chicago Mafia boss had come all the way to her balloon cart to say thank you. "Your daughter told me something I should have known 8 months ago," Jude said, slow, each word heavy as stone. "My son thinks he killed his mother. 8 months. He carried that guilt for 8 months. Alone. He didn't tell anyone, and I lived in the same house and didn't know." His hand trembled. Elise could see it clearly. His right hand, the hand the Chicago underworld knew had signed life and death orders, the hand that could move millions of dollars without a flicker of expression. That hand was shaking now, shaking because of an 8-year-old child, shaking because a father had finally seen how completely he'd failed. "I don't know what to do," he said, and the sentence didn't sound like something a boss would say. It sounded like a plea for help. Elise stayed silent for a moment. She studied the man in front of her, trying to find the trap, the scheme, the hidden angle that 27 years of living had taught her powerful men always carried somewhere. But she didn't find anything except a broken man. "You're asking a balloon seller how to raise your child?" she said, not mocking, just stating the truth. "I'm asking a mother," Jude replied. "Your daughter saw my son's pain from outside the fence, while I lived under the same roof and stayed blind." The Chicago wind swept past, shaking the balloons dancing above the cart. Phoebe sat behind her mother, wide-eyed, staring at the tall man speaking to her mother in a voice she'd never heard an adult use before. The voice of someone asking to be saved. "Be there," Elise said, blunt and steady, not deferential, but not cold either. "I don't know who you are out there. I don't know what you do. And honestly, I don't want to know. But I know this. An 8-year-old child is carrying guilt that isn't his. And he needs his dad. Not a boss, not money, not a 12-bedroom mansion. He needs you to sit down beside him and say, 'I'm here. This isn't your fault. That's it. Be there. Don't let him carry it one more day.'" Jude looked at her, silent. Then he spoke, so softly the wind almost took the words away. "No one has told me the truth since Kat died. Everyone, the hundreds of people around me, not one of them has said a single true thing. Because they're afraid of you," Elise answered, eyes steady, unblinking, refusing to back away. "I'm not. I've got nothing to lose, Mr. Mercer, so I've got nothing to fear." Jude looked at the woman standing in front of him. 27 years old, hands cracked, jacket pinned with a safety pin, selling balloons for $2 each to feed her child. And she had just said to his face what hundreds of soldiers, partners, lawyers, enemies, none of them had ever dared to say. He nodded, slowly, heavily. Then he turned and walked back to the Escalade. Brennan opened the door, glanced at Elise for a second, and in the loyal bodyguard's eyes there was something like surprise. In 15 years at Jude Mercer's side, Brennan had never seen his boss nod to anyone. It happened 5 days after the afternoon Jude Mercer stood by the balloon cart and said thank you. Rumors moved faster than the Chicago wind. The Mafia boss went to see the balloon lady, stood there talking to her for nearly 10 minutes. Brennan stood guard, like he was escorting a queen instead of a street vendor. The story traveled from one mouth to another ear, through the school gates, into the parents' group chats, changing a little more every time it was told. By the time it reached Patricia Langford and Monica Chen, the two wealthiest mothers in the Westbrook Academy Parent Association, it had turned into, "That balloon seller is trying to hook Jude Mercer, and she's even using her daughter as bait for his son." On Thursday afternoon, Jude came to pick Oliver up earlier than usual. He stood beside the school gate, instead of sitting in the car like before, because Elise's words still rang in his head every day. Be there. He was learning how to be there, even though he didn't yet know where to start. Patricia Langford stood about 5 meters from him, in the middle of a cluster of 4 mothers in fur coats and high heels, Starbucks coffee in hand, her mouth running nonstop. They didn't know Jude was close enough to hear, or they knew and didn't care. "Did you see that balloon woman across the street?" Patricia said, her voice high and sharp, the kind of voice used to ordering housekeepers around, clinging to the Mercers like a leech that smells blood. Just the type who catches the scent of money. Monica giggled. And that little girl too, sitting outside the fence staring in like a stray dog waiting for a bone. Like mother, like daughter. Their little laughs rippled through the group. Another mother added, her voice lower but still clear. "That kind of trash shouldn't be allowed near decent children. This school is getting worse and worse." Jude turned his head, slowly, like the barrel of a gun swiveling toward its target. He walked over, not rushed, each step steady on the pavement, and when he stopped in front of the women, his shadow swallowed all 4 of them. Patricia looked up, her smile freezing on her lips. "You just compared a 6-year-old child to a dog." Jude's voice was soft, very soft. Soft in the way Brennan had heard hundreds of times right before his boss made a decision someone would pay for. "Jude, we were just gossiping. We didn't mean..." Patricia stammered, her coffee shaking in her hand. "That balloon seller," Jude cut in, his eyes moving from one face to the next, slowly, as if counting, "did what all your tuition money, all the psychologists, all of you and this fancy parent association put together couldn't do. She made my son want to live." A lethal silence fell. No one dared breathe too hard. "If I hear one more word about her or her daughter..." Jude tilted his head and smiled slightly. A smile Brennan recognized immediately. The smile his boss wore before he destroyed an entire operation. "We'll have a different kind of conversation. And I'm sure you don't want that kind." He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. The 4 women stood there, faces drained white, coffee cooling in their hands, and for the first time in their lives they understood what it felt like to be so afraid they forgot how to swallow. Jude thought that was the end of it. He thought he'd done the right thing. He thought he'd protected Elise in the way he understood. The only way he understood. With strength, with fear, with power. But he was wrong. The next day, Elise waited for him at the corner a block away from the school gate. She stood there with her arms crossed, and when Jude approached, he saw at once that her eyes were not the eyes of gratitude. "What did you just do?" Elise's voice shook, but not from fear, from anger. "I protected you." "Protected?" Elise let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You threatened people, with your boss routine. With that smile, the whole city knows what it means." She stepped closer, eyes red, voice pressed down so she wouldn't scream in the street. "Do you know what the whole school is saying about me now? Mercer's mistress. That balloon girl is being kept by the boss. Those women won't be quiet, Mr. Mercer. They won't dare touch you, but they'll get back at me. With complaints, with whispers, with making sure I lose my spot. And the one who pays is me, not you. No one would dare. In your world, no one would dare." Elise cut him off. "But this isn't your world. This is mine. Where people take revenge with paperwork, with rumors, with the way they look at you when you walk past. You don't understand because you've never had to worry about what you'll eat tomorrow." Jude opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I don't need anyone to save me," Elise said, her voice dropping, but every word heavier than the one before. "I've lived 27 years without any boss protecting me. I've had money thrown in my face. I've been abandoned by my family. I've had the whole world tell me I don't deserve anything. And I'm still standing here. I'm still raising my daughter. I don't need you throwing your power around and walking away feeling good about yourself while I stay behind to pick up the pieces." She turned and walked off. She didn't look back. Back straight, chin lifted, steps quick on the cold sidewalk. Jude stood there. He stood on a Chicago street corner with the wind hitting his face. And for the first time in his life, Jude Mercer, the boss, was scolded to his face by someone who wasn't afraid of him, then left behind without a single word he could answer with. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to say he hadn't thought about the consequences. He wanted to say that for the first time in years, he'd acted on instinct instead of strategy. But he couldn't. Because words never came when they truly mattered. And standing there watching Elise Dawson's back grow smaller, Jude realized something strange. He wasn't angry. He respected her. More than anyone he'd ever met, because she wasn't afraid of him, and because she was right. Elise knew what was going to happen. She'd warned Jude already. "They'll get back at me." But knowing it ahead of time didn't make it hurt any less when it finally arrived. 4 days after the afternoon she scolded Jude Mercer on a street corner, Elise received a message from the Westbrook Academy principal's office. Mrs. Whitfield wanted to see her. First thing tomorrow morning. Elise came to the school at 8 o'clock, with Phoebe sitting on the folding chair outside on the sidewalk waiting for her, arms wrapped around her sketchbook, her feet still bundled in a wool scarf instead of socks. Mrs. Whitfield's office was on the second floor, windows looking out over the schoolyard, the air carrying old book smell and a faint perfume. The principal sat behind her desk, a stack of papers about 10 pages thick in front of her, reading with a slow, deliberate pace, as if she wanted Elise to sit there long enough to understand who held power in this room. "Complaints from multiple parents, Mrs. Whitfield finally said without looking up. "The allegation is that the street vendor outside the school gate has behaved inappropriately toward students, suggesting she's trying to take advantage of affluent families, creating a negative influence on the educational environment." "That's a lie," Elise said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There are 4 signatures." Mrs. Whitfield turned to the last page. 4 parents, 4 families who pay full tuition, on time, every year. The final sentence didn't need anything added. Money spoke. Elise understood. "What are the consequences?" she asked, blunt. "You are prohibited from selling within a 200-meter radius of the school gate. Effective immediately. The school has notified the area management. 200 meters. Elise calculated fast in her head. 200 meters meant standing out by the Washington and State intersection, where hardly anyone walked, where no parents waited to pick up children, where no kids ran past asking their mothers for a balloon. 200 meters meant losing 90% of her customers. It meant that even on her best day, she'd sell 2 or 3 balloons instead of 30. It meant she wouldn't make rent next month. "This is the only spot where I get customers, Mrs. Whitfield," Elise said, keeping her voice calm, but her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles went white. 200 meters means I'll be standing where there isn't a single person. 4 rich mothers sign their names over breakfast in their mansions, and my daughter won't have milk tonight. Do you understand that?" Mrs. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. In her eyes there was something like sympathy, but it was buried under the thick practicality of a woman who'd run a private school for 20 years. "I understand, Elise, and I know you haven't done anything wrong, but when paying parents speak, the school has to listen. I can't stand up to the parent association." Elise stood. She didn't say anything more. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She walked out of the office, down the hallway, down the stairs, out through the school gates, and only when she saw Phoebe on the folding chair coloring the sky with a blue crayon did Elise feel her eyes burn. She turned her face away. "Don't cry in front of your child." Jude found out that same afternoon. Not because Elise told him. She didn't. She didn't call. She didn't contact him. She didn't need him to know. He found out because Brennan heard it from the school's security guard. Jude arrived at Westbrook Academy at 4 in the afternoon and walked straight into Mrs. Whitfield's office without an appointment. No one stopped him. No one dared. "The complaint. I want to see it." He didn't ask. He stated it. "Mrs." Whitfield looked at him, ready to say, "This is confidential." But when Jude Mercer's eyes locked onto hers, she decided the word confidential didn't exist in the dictionary when you were facing this man. She set the stack of papers on the desk. Jude read, turned the page, read the first signature. His hand stopped. The handwriting was familiar. Black ink, the strong and thin strokes of someone who'd written with a fountain pen her whole life. Dorothy Mercer, his mother. Jude didn't say a word. He set the papers down, stood, and walked out. 20 minutes later, the Escalade stopped in front of the Mercer home in Lincoln Park, where Dorothy had lived since her husband died 15 years earlier. The house was old, inherited oak furniture, oil portraits of great-grandparents on the walls, high ceilings, glossy wooden floors. The scent of lavender from a vase the housekeeper replaced every 3 days. Dorothy sat in an armchair by the window, her back straight as steel, a teacup in her hand. And when Jude entered, she didn't look surprised. She'd been waiting for him. "You destroyed the only way that woman can make a living," Jude said, his voice pressed low, but each word vibrating like a string pulled too tight. "A 27-year-old woman raising a child alone, and you signed a paper banning her from earning money. For what?" Dorothy set her teacup down. Gently, calmly. 70 years of living had taught her never to let anyone see her shake. "Because I don't want to dig another grave." Jude stopped. He hadn't expected that answer. Dorothy stood, walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and took out a folder. "You think I don't know who that balloon girl is? I had someone look into her. 27. Single mother. South Side. Clean record. No criminal history. No debt. No connections to anyone in your world." She looked at Jude. "She's clean. I know. And that's exactly the problem." "What are you talking about?" "Catherine was clean too." Dorothy's voice didn't tremble, but her eyes were red. "Catherine was good too. Catherine loved you too. And Catherine died because she was close to you, Jude. Your world killed her." The room fell silent. The wall clock ticked. "Calloway is still out there," Dorothy went on, her tone hardening. "He still wants you gone, and he will look for weakness. Last time it was Catherine. This time, who will it be? The balloon woman? Her 6-year-old daughter? I'll protect them. That's exactly what you said when you married Catherine." The blow landed clean. Jude took a step back like he'd been slapped. Dorothy moved closer, her eyes bright with tears, but her voice didn't soften. "I didn't do this for pride. I don't care if she's poor or rich, if she sells balloons or diamonds. I did it because I cried at my daughter-in-law's funeral. I watched Oliver in a black suit standing beside his mother's coffin, and not understanding what was happening. And I don't want to cry at the next funeral. Hate me if you want, but don't tell me I'm wrong." Jude stood there in a room full of family portraits, in the lavender-scented air and the late afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. And he didn't know what to say. Because his mother wasn't wrong. She wasn't evil. She was a mother who'd seen death repeat itself and was desperate to stop it in the only way she knew. But she wasn't right either. Because the way she chose crushed an innocent person. Jude's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. A message from Westbrook Academy. "Oliver Mercer did not return after recess. He is missing. Please contact us immediately." The phone slipped out of Jude's hand and hit the wooden floor. the screen cracking straight across. He was already running for the front door before it even finished falling. Dorothy stood alone in the living room, her hands gripping the armchair, watching her son disappear through the doorway. And for the first time in 70 years, she didn't know whether she'd done the right thing or destroyed one more thing instead. The Escalade blew through 3 red lights on the way from Dorothy's house to Westbrook Academy. Brennan didn't need Jude to say a word. He hit the gas the moment he saw his boss's face. 7 minutes, the longest 7 minutes of Jude Mercer's life. He sat in the back seat, both hands clamped around his knees, staring straight ahead and seeing nothing except the words on the shattered phone screen. Oliver Mercer did not return. Missing. His son was missing. When the Escalade screeched to a stop at the school gate, Jude was out before the car had fully halted. The gates were wide open, and inside was chaos. Teachers ran the corridors calling Oliver's name. Security searched every classroom, every storage room, every restroom. 2 police cruisers were already parked in the yard, lights flashing, radios crackling through the cold air. Mrs. Whitfield stood in the middle of the yard with a walkie-talkie in her hand, her face drained pale, coordinating search groups in a voice she tried to keep steady, but everyone could hear it shaking. "We've checked the entire first floor and second floor," one teacher reported. No sign. "The gym storage, the art room, the music room, all done, empty." Jude walked through the gate, Brennan behind him, and when he appeared in the yard, the air changed. Teachers edged aside. Officers glanced over, and then looked away. Everyone knew who Jude Mercer was. Everyone was thinking the same thing. The Mafia boss has lost his child at a private school. This is going to be a very bad day for everyone. "How long?" Jude asked Mrs. Whitfield, his voice so flat it was frightening. 45 minutes, the principal answered. Miss Garcia says Oliver was still in the yard at the start of recess, sitting on the stone bench like always. But when the bell rang for class, he wasn't there. "We've searched everywhere." 45 minutes, Jude repeated. His son had been missing for 45 minutes, and Jude had been standing in his mother's house arguing about pride and the past. 45 minutes of Oliver somewhere alone, terrified, thinking no one was looking, thinking no one wanted to look. "Have you checked the cameras?" Brennan asked, stepping up beside Jude, his voice professional, cold. "We're reviewing them," the head of security said, "but the cameras don't cover the entire east yard. Near the fence there's a blind spot." "The kid didn't leave the school," Brennan said with certainty. "The gates have cameras and security. He's still somewhere inside." Jude stood in the middle of the yard. Around him, people moved, shouted, searched. But he stayed still, because for the first time in his life, Jude Mercer realized his power was useless. Money couldn't find his son. Underworld connections couldn't find his son. The name that made Chicago tremble couldn't find an 8-year-old boy hiding in this building. Jude could order 100 men to tear the city apart in an hour. He could make one phone call, and an entire neighborhood would lock down. But he couldn't find his child, because this wasn't a war of guns and money. This was a war inside a shattered child who wanted to disappear from the world, and Jude had no weapons for that war. "Boss." Brennan stood beside him, voice low, only for the 2 of them. "I've got people checking every exit. The kid's still in the school. We'll find him." Jude didn't answer. His eyes swept the yard, the corridors, every corner his gaze could reach, as if he stared long enough, hard enough, he could see through walls and find his son. "Boss." Brennan spoke again, and this time his voice was different, not the bodyguard's voice. The voice of a man who'd spent 15 years at Jude's side, and was speaking the truth for the first time. "Oliver needs his dad, not a boss." Jude turned to Brennan. 15 years. 15 years this man had stood behind him, opened car doors, carried guns, never wasted a word. And today Brennan said that. Jude nodded. Slowly, like a man waking up. Then he heard footsteps, fast, urgent, from the school gate. Elise Dawson ran into the yard, breathless, cheeks flushed, hair messy. She wasn't supposed to be here. She'd been banned from coming within 200 meters of the school, but she was here. Mrs. Whitfield moved to block her in the middle of the yard. "Miss Dawson, you're not allowed. A child is missing and you're worried about who's allowed?" Elise cut her off, her eyes fierce, her voice sharp as a blade. "I've sold balloons outside this gate for 2 years. I know every blind corner, every wall, every gap, even the places you don't know exist." She looked at Jude. Jude looked back. No words needed. He nodded. Let her through. Mrs. Whitfield opened her mouth to protest, but she saw Jude's eyes and swallowed the objection. Elise didn't wait. She turned and ran toward the east side of the building, where the yard ended near the old gym structure and the iron fence that circled the grounds. Jude ran after her. Brennan ran after him. Elise cut around the gym corner, moved along the fence, and stopped where an old brick wall met the iron bars and formed a hidden angle. Weeds rose as high as a grown man's chest. Old trash, dry leaves, things no one cleared because no one knew this place existed. There's a gap between the storage wall and the fence, Elise said, breathing hard. Adults don't notice because nobody looks down that low. But Phoebe crawled in here once to get a balloon that blew through. She told me. She said it's really dark and really tight. Only a kid can fit. Elise dropped to her knees and pushed the weeds aside. And there, between the brick wall and the iron fence, in a narrow pocket of darkness where light barely reached, was a small curled-up shape in the weeds. Oliver. The boy sat with his knees drawn up, both arms wrapped tight around the red balloon that was fully deflated now, wrinkled, thin as paper. The balloon Phoebe had given him. He'd held it for weeks, held it when it was round and full, held it as it slowly shrank, held it even when it became nothing but a crumpled scrap of red rubber, because it was the only thing anyone had given him that wasn't pity. His face was pale, his lips were cracked and dry, his eyes were shut, his head bowed into his knees, and he repeated, over and over, a voice so small it sounded like a whisper from the bottom of a well. 3 words. The same 3 words without stopping, like a prayer from a child who had lost all faith in the world. Everybody leaves. Everybody leaves. Everybody leaves. Jude saw his son, less than 3 meters away. All he had to do was step through the weeds, drop to his knees, squeeze into the gap, wrap his arms around the boy, and say, I'm here. That was all. But his legs didn't move. As if 20 years of building an empire out of coldness, 20 years of giving orders instead of feeling, 20 years of using power in place of love, had poured concrete over his feet at the exact moment he needed to walk the most. He wanted to call his child's name. He wanted to say, Oliver, it's Dad. But his throat locked up. He was a man who could face enemies without blinking, who could make life and death decisions in 3 seconds, who could lift a phone and change the fate of an entire block with a single sentence. But he couldn't cross 3 meters to his own son. Because he was afraid. Afraid he'd hold Oliver, and Oliver wouldn't hold back. Afraid he'd say, I'm here, and Oliver would look at him and ask, then where were you 8 months ago? Afraid he was too late. Then he heard footsteps, small, light, fast. From behind him, a tiny shadow slipped past, ducked under Brennan's arm, skimmed through the weeds, and before anyone could react, Phoebe had flattened herself to the ground, crawled into the narrow gap between the brick wall and the iron fence, the gap no adult could fit through, and vanished into the darkness inside. Phoebe! Elise screamed. She lunged forward, but the opening was too tight. Her shoulders caught, her arm reaching in and finding nothing. Phoebe, come out right now. But Phoebe didn't come out. She crawled over dry leaves, past old trash, through damp shadow, until she could sit up right beside Oliver. He was still curled tight, eyes shut, both arms locked around the deflated balloon against his chest. His mouth still repeated those 3 words without stopping, as if his heartbeat had been replaced by a curse. Everybody leaves. Everybody leaves. Everybody leaves. Phoebe didn't say anything. She didn't hug him. She didn't touch him. She only sat down next to Oliver, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and she stayed there, silent. Outside the gap, Elise gripped the iron bars, staring into the darkness and seeing nothing but 2 small shapes. Jude stood beside her, one hand braced against the brick wall, his whole body trembling. Brennan stood behind them, one hand on his boss's shoulder for the first time in 15 years. No one spoke. There was only wind threading through the fence, and Oliver's whispering drifting out like crying from the bottom of a well. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. Silence stretched until it felt like an hour. Then the whispering slowed, stopped. Oliver opened his eyes. In the dim darkness, he saw Phoebe, sitting beside him, not talking, not demanding, not pitying, just there. Phoebe? His voice was hoarse, the voice of someone who'd repeated the same 3 words for so long he'd forgotten how to say any others. I'm here. 2 words, weightless. And yet they landed in the darkness like someone lighting a candle. I thought you left too, Oliver whispered, his voice breaking. Like Mom. Like everybody. Friends don't leave each other, Phoebe said, her 6-year-old voice steady, serious, as if this were the most obvious truth in the world, and she couldn't understand why grown-ups didn't know it. Maybe grown-ups have to go away sometimes, but they still love us. Like my balloons, even when they fly away high in the sky, they are still there, just looking down at us. Your mom is like that too. She went quiet for a moment, then added, softer, gentler. Like balloons. When you let go, they fly away, but they're still up in the sky, still looking down. Your mom is like that too. She's up in the sky. She's still watching you. Oliver stared at Phoebe, his eyes, exhausted eyes, shadowed by bruised half-moons that for 8 months had only known how to stare at unread pages and drawings full of darkness, suddenly flickered with something. Not hope, not yet, but something that came before hope. The feeling that he wasn't alone. Then Oliver cried, not the kind of crying he'd trained himself to do for 8 months. Silent crying, swallowed crying, crying with no sound because he was afraid of bothering grown-ups, crying that soaked his pillow and then got flipped over in the morning like nothing happened. Not that. He cried for real. Loud, deep. From the deepest place inside his small body, the place where for 8 months he'd stuffed the guilt, the fear, the loneliness, the missing his mother, the screaming in the car, the sound of glass breaking, the smell of blood, the sight of his mother slumped over the steering wheel. All of it crammed down there until now. And now it exploded. A freeing cry. A cry like Chicago rain. It wouldn't stop. Phoebe wrapped her arms around him. 2 tiny arms around Oliver's shoulders, holding tight. And she didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Sometimes a 6-year-old understands when words are done working, and only an embrace can do the rest. Outside the gap, Jude Mercer stood against the iron fence and listened to his son's sobs echoing out. Sobs he hadn't heard for 8 months because the boy had hidden them too well, and tears ran down Jude's face. He didn't wipe them. He didn't hide them. He didn't turn away. He stood there, the Chicago Mafia boss the underworld feared, crying outside a crack in the wall of an elementary school because the 8-year-old inside had finally been able to cry. Brennan stood behind Jude, facing the fence, staring out at the empty parking lot. His shoulders shook too, but he didn't turn around. In 15 years with Jude Mercer, Brennan had seen a lot, but he'd never seen his boss cry, and he decided he would never tell anyone about today. Elise knelt at the opening, her hand still gripping the bars, tears on her cheeks, but her mouth curved into a smile. Her daughter, 6 years old, feet wrapped in a wool scarf instead of socks, hands smudged with crayon, was holding a boy the whole world had forgotten, and somehow, with a heart too large for her small body, she was pulling him back out of the dark. They got Oliver out of the gap by removing 2 iron fence bars. Brennan did it by using a heavy tire iron from the Escalade, leveraging the rusted metal until it gave way. As if 15 years of violence finally had a use for exactly one thing. Oliver wouldn't let go of Phoebe. When the school medic lifted him onto a stretcher, his hand was still locked around the little girl's, and no adult had the nerve to separate the 2 children. The nurse's office at Westbrook Academy was small, bright under white lights, sharp with the smell of disinfectant. Oliver lay on the cot, pale but no longer crying. His eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling, then turning to the right, where Phoebe sat on a plastic chair beside him, feet not touching the floor, her hand still holding his. The deflated red balloon rested on Oliver's chest, wrinkled and paper-thin, but he wouldn't let anyone take it away. The school doctor did a quick check. Low blood pressure, fast pulse, exhaustion. He needed to be taken to the hospital for monitoring because leukemia could be affected by stress. But the boy was stable, at least physically. The rest of it, no one could measure with a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. Jude stood outside the nurse's office door, watching through the small glass window. He watched his son lying there, hand in the hand of a 6-year-old girl, and he realized the only thread keeping Oliver in this world wasn't him, wasn't the mansion, wasn't the team of nannies and private doctors, but the crayon-smudged hand of a child whose mother sold balloons for $2 each outside the fence. Police took statements, teachers wrote reports, Mrs. Whitfield called the board. Administrative noise swirled all around, but Jude didn't hear it. He walked out to the backyard, where the Chicago afternoon was losing its light, the sky shifting from orange to purple, and whined off Lake Michigan, carried the first bite of early winter. He sat down on the stone bench, the bench beneath the oak tree, the place Oliver sat every day. The wood was worn smooth. Jude laid his hand on that polished spot and felt his chest crack open all over again. Footsteps behind him. Elise walked up and stopped a few steps away. She didn't sit at first. The two of them were silent for a moment, a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of two strangers from separate worlds, but the silence of two people who had just witnessed something that would change them forever. "Your daughter," Jude finally said, his voice hoarse and broken, each word forced out like it cost him breath. "Your daughter did what I couldn't." He looked down at his hands, hands that had signed orders, held guns, counted money, shaken enemies' hands and betrayed them, hands that had done everything in this world except one thing: hold his son when he needed it. "Teach me." His voice split completely. No boss voice left. No command left. Only the voice of a 36-year-old man begging. "I don't know how to be with my child. My wife died because of my world. Catherine died because she was close to me. Because she loved me. Because she wouldn't leave when there was still time." His hands trembled. "My son thinks he killed his mother. He carried that guilt for 8 months. He's sick for real, in his body, and he doesn't even want to fight, because he doesn't want to live. My 8-year-old doesn't want to live, Miss Dawson." He looked up at Elise. His eyes were red, his face helpless in a way no amount of money could buy off, no amount of power could hide. And I stood there, right outside that gap in the wall, 3 meters from my child, and I couldn't move. I froze. I, the man all of Chicago fears, froze in front of my 8-year-old because I don't know how to be a father. Kat knew. Kat did everything, and I let Kat die. Elise listened, silent. She didn't interrupt. She didn't comfort. She stood with her arms at her sides, eyes steady on the man sitting on the bench, and she listened to him fall apart piece by piece. When Jude finished, emptied out, shoulders slumping like the bones had been pulled from him, Elise finally spoke. "Why are you asking me?" "Because you're the only person who looks at me and sees a father failing, instead of seeing Mercer the boss." A long silence. Wind moved through the oak, leaves spiraling down. "I don't trust powerful men," Elise said, her voice softer, but still direct, still refusing to flatter him. "Phoebe's father was rich. When he found out I was pregnant, he threw money in my face like he was paying a bill for something broken. And you," she looked at Jude, "you're 100 times more dangerous than he ever was. Your mother was right. Anyone near you gets hurt. You know about my mother? The whole school knows. Rumors travel faster than balloons." Elise paused, then sat down on the stone bench, leaving a careful space between them, not too close, not too far. "1 year," she said, staring straight ahead instead of at him. "You've got 1 year. No money, no power, no using Brennan or your men to fix my life. No gifts, no paying bills, no solving problems by threatening people." She turned her head and looked at him, eyes serious, unblinking. "Just show up, for your son first. Be there when he needs you. Talk when he's ready. Cry when you need to cry. Learn how to be a father, not a boss. And if after 1 year you've truly changed, not just with me, but with your own life, with the dark world you're living in." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "And if I don't change?" Jude asked, his voice small. Elise looked at him, and in her eyes there was something Jude wasn't used to seeing in anyone who looked at him. Not fear, not greed, not flattery, but truth. Plain and simple. "Then at least you'll still have your son, and that's enough." Jude nodded, slowly, heavily. This was the hardest deal of his life. Not because the terms were harsh, but because for the first time in 36 years, he was facing a negotiation where he couldn't use money, couldn't use threats, couldn't use any weapon he had. The only thing Elise Dawson demanded from him was the one thing he had the least of: presence. The Chicago light faded completely. The school lights came on. Inside the nurse's office, Oliver still held Phoebe's hand. And outside, on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, 2 broken adults sat near each other in silence, each carrying a different world on their shoulders. And somehow, in this moment, those worlds touched without anyone getting hurt. 3 days after that afternoon on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, Jude Mercer did something he'd never done in his life. He came home at 6 in the evening, Brennan stopped the car in front of the mansion and glanced into the rearview mirror, wanting to ask something, but swallowing the words. His boss stepped out with a paper bag in his hand. Inside was the photo album he'd taken from the storage room that morning, the album Catherine had made by hand during the first 3 years of Oliver's life. Brown leather cover, the spine labeled in her neat round handwriting, Oliver's first years. The album had been sitting in Catherine's box since the day she died. Jude had never opened it, because opening it meant seeing Catherine smile, and seeing Catherine smile meant remembering she would never smile again. But tonight he carried it up to the second floor, walked down the hallway, and knocked on Oliver's door. Knocked. He didn't just open it. He didn't walk in like the owner of the house. He knocked, and he waited. Silence inside. Then Oliver's voice, small, surprised. "Someone there?" "Dad." One word, the heaviest Jude Mercer had ever said. A longer silence. Then light footsteps on the floor. The door opened. Oliver stood there in pale blue pajamas that hung too loose on him. His face still gray. The shadows under his eyes still deep. But his eyes were different since the day in the Gap. No longer empty. There was something in them now, small and fragile, like a match flame in the wind, but real. He looked at his father, then at the album in his father's hands, then back at his father. "I want to talk to you," Jude said, his voice careful, slow, like a man walking on thin ice afraid it will crack. "About Mom." Oliver didn't answer, but he opened the door wider. And that was the only invitation Jude needed. Jude stepped into his son's room. The second time this week, but the first time while Oliver was awake. The room was still cold, the curtains still shut, but something new sat on the desk. The deflated red balloon had been carefully taped to a piece of cardboard with clear tape, preserved like a work of art. Beside it was the little drawing of 2 people holding hands under a red balloon, the one Phoebe had slipped through the fence. Jude saw it. His chest tightened. He sat down on Oliver's bed and set the album on his lap. Oliver stood in the middle of the room a few steps away, as if he still hadn't decided whether to come closer. Jude opened the album. The first page. A photo of Catherine in the hospital, hair damp with sweat, face exhausted, and still smiling like the sun while she held newborn Oliver in her arms. Beneath it, Catherine's handwriting. "The best day of Mommy's life. Oliver James Mercer. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. 2 big eyes looking at me like he's known me from another lifetime." Jude read it out loud. His voice shook on the words, "best day." Oliver moved closer. 1 step, then another. Then he sat on the bed, half a meter from Jude, and stared down at the photo. "Mom was pretty," Oliver said, small, like a child trying out a word he hadn't used in a long time. "Mom was really pretty." Jude turned the page. A photo of Oliver crawling in nothing but a diaper, grinning with 4 little teeth. A photo of Oliver standing for the first time, both hands clutching Catherine's leg, his face serious as if he were completing a sacred mission. A photo of the 3 of them on the beach, Catherine in a straw hat, Oliver on Jude's shoulders, ice cream dripping down his fingers. On every page, Jude told a story. "That day you crawled for the first time, you crawled straight to Mom, not to me. And she laughed at me for a whole week." Oliver listened. At first he was quiet. Then he started asking, "Did Mom laugh a lot, Dad?" "All day. She was the loudest laugh in the house." "Did Mom get mad?" "She got mad when I came home late. Then she'd hug me and say, 'Don't do that next time.' And then I'd do it again. And she'd get mad again. And then she'd hug me again." Oliver almost smiled. Almost. But Jude saw it. They were halfway through the album when Oliver suddenly stopped. His hand gripped the edge of the page. His whole body went stiff. "Dad, I'm listening. It was my fault." The words came out like blood seeping from an old wound ripped open. "I screamed in the car. Mom turned around to look at me. Mom didn't see that other car. Mom died because of me." He trembled. All over. The album slid off Jude's lap and fell onto the bed, opening to a page where Catherine was holding Oliver on a swing, both of them laughing, sunlight in their hair, as if the world contained nothing but happiness. Oliver stared at that picture, and tears spilled down, landing on Catherine's face in the photo. Jude didn't think. For the first time, he didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh outcomes. He followed instinct. The instinct he'd buried for 20 years under the armor of the man he'd become. He pulled his son into his arms, big arms around a small body, drawing the boy close, holding tight. And Jude could feel every rib through the thin pajamas, could feel how thin Oliver was, how light, how fragile. "It wasn't your fault," Jude said, his voice breaking, but he didn't stop. "Listen to me. It wasn't your fault. Mom died in an accident nobody could stop. Not because you screamed, not because she turned around. Even if you'd been silent as an angel in that car, it still would have happened. Because it was an accident. Nobody is to blame." He swallowed. The next sentence was harder than anything he'd ever said. "And if anyone is to blame here, it's me. Because I wasn't there that day. Mom asked me to go with her, and I said I was busy. I always said I was busy. Busy making money, busy with work, busy with everything in the world except the two people who mattered most." He felt Oliver shaking in his arms, shaking like a leaf in a storm. "I should have been the one driving. I should have been there. Mom shouldn't have gone alone. It's my fault, Oliver. Not yours. Never yours," Oliver cried, into his father's chest. A different kind of crying than the day in the Gap. That day had been an explosion, a breaking cry. Tonight was a letting go, the cry of a child finally hearing the sentence he'd needed for 8 months. "It wasn't your fault." 4 words strong enough to lift the black sky he'd been carrying above his head for 240 days. "Dad." Oliver looked up, eyes red, nose red, voice caught. "Are you going to leave again?" Jude understood the question. Not leave for a specific place. Leave as in go away. Disappear. Be absent. Be busy. Not be here. Like every day for 8 years. "No," Jude said. He looked straight into his son's eyes. And for the first time, he wasn't speaking for strategy, for profit, for control. He was speaking because he meant it. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver studied him, searching his face for something. A promise. A truth. Something solid. Then the boy nodded. Small, but real. He rested his head against Jude's chest, his eyes slowly closing, and the cologne on Jude's suit didn't smell like his mother's jasmine, but it was warm, and tonight that was enough. Jude sat there holding his son, his back against the headboard, not daring to move in case Oliver woke. He looked down at the child in his arms, at the sleeping face that for the first time didn't twist in nightmares, at the hands lying loose instead of clenched. And he saw what he'd almost missed. Catherine's framed photo wasn't on Oliver's chest anymore. It was on the nightstand, face down, as if Oliver had set it aside before his father came in. Not because he'd forgotten his mother, but because tonight he didn't need to hold her picture to sleep. Because Dad was here, flesh and blood, warm, real. Jude closed his eyes. Tears slid down and soaked into Oliver's hair. And the Chicago Mafia boss fell asleep on his son's bed, the photo album open halfway beside him, the page showing Catherine laughing on the swing. Golden sunlight, Oliver tiny, and the world back then still whole. The first month was the hardest. Jude Mercer, a man who was used to waking at 5 in the morning to read reports from his networks, now woke at 5 in the morning to go into the kitchen. The Mercer kitchen was as large as Elise's entire studio, packed with equipment Catherine had used every day, and Jude hadn't touched once in his life. On the first morning, he burned the eggs. Not a little burn, but black burned. Smoke rolling through the house, the fire alarm screaming at 6:15 in the morning, the nanny running downstairs thinking the place was on fire, Brennan kicking the kitchen door open with a fire extinguisher in his hand. Oliver stood on the stairs in pajamas, eyes heavy with sleep, watching his father in a kitchen full of smoke, holding a charred pan, his face completely helpless. The boy didn't laugh, but he didn't turn away either. He stood there and watched, and that was enough. The second morning the eggs still burned, but less. The third morning they were half raw, half cooked. The fourth morning Oliver came down earlier, sat at the table before his father called him, and when Jude set the plate of eggs down, the boy ate. He didn't say they were good. He didn't say they were bad. He just ate. But Jude remembered the nanny's words from 8 months earlier. He sat at the table. Not, he ate. Now Oliver ate, and Jude understood that his burnt eggs were worth more than any perfect breakfast the nanny could set out, because his plate carried something she couldn't. His father's hands. In the second week, Jude took Oliver to chemotherapy himself. Before, the nanny took him, or the private driver did. Oliver sat alone in the back seat staring out the window, And when the needle went into his arm, nobody held his hand. Now Jude sat beside him. He didn't know what to say in the infusion room. He sat there like a stone among beeping machines and the smell of disinfectant, holding Oliver's hand, his hand too large against his son's, and he was afraid he'd squeeze too hard and hurt him because the boy was so thin. But Oliver squeezed back. The first chemo with his father beside him. Oliver didn't turn his face to the wall like he always did. He looked at his father, and when the needle went in, he flinched, but he didn't pull away. The second infusion, he spoke to the nurse, his voice small but clear. "I'm ready." The nurse almost dropped the medication line because it was the first time in 8 months Oliver Mercer had spoken voluntarily in the infusion room. In the second month, things began to shift, slow as ice melting, but real. Mrs. Whitfield called Jude to the school over something no one expected. Oliver talked to another child. Not a classmate. Phoebe. The girl was now allowed inside the school during recess because Jude had spoken to the administration. Not with a boss's voice. He'd learned that lesson. But with a handwritten request. Stiff letters from a man who wasn't used to writing anything that wasn't an order, asking permission for Phoebe Dawson to enter the yard as the personal guest of the Mercer family. Mrs. Whitfield approved it immediately, partly because the request was legitimate, and partly because she didn't want a second Oliver missing incident. Phoebe and Oliver sat beside each other under the oak tree every recess. Phoebe drew. Oliver watched. Sometimes he picked up a crayon and drew too, his lines trembling, but steadier each day. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without words. Outside the school gates, Elise Dawson pushed her balloon cart to a new spot. Grant Park. Farther. Fewer customers. But she didn't complain. She woke an hour earlier every day to push the cart 12 blocks. Pumped balloons in the January Chicago wind that cut skin like knives. Sold 15 on a good day, 7 on a bad one. And at night, after Phoebe fell asleep, Elise sat on the bed and opened the GED prep book she'd bought with 3 weeks of savings, studying until her eyelids drooped shut. No one told her to study. No one forced her. She chose it. Because if Jude Mercer could learn to cook eggs at 6 in the morning, Elise Dawson could learn algebra at 11 at night. In the 3rd month, Jude made his first mistake. He asked Brennan to deliver an envelope to Elise's studio. Inside was $5,000 in cash, and a note that said, "For Phoebe." Brennan hadn't even made it off the stairs before Elise opened her door, chased him down, and shoved the envelope back into his hand. "Give it back to your boss," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes lit with the kind of restrained anger Brennan recognized immediately. "And tell him I made myself clear." That afternoon, when Jude came to Grant Park, Elise stood by the balloon cart and looked at him with a disappointed expression that hurt him more than being yelled at. "I told you. No money. No power. You forget that fast? I only wanted to help. Then help the right way." Elise looked at him. "You know Grant Park doesn't get many balloon customers because nobody passes by. You know half this city. Tell me where it's busy and where I'm allowed to sell. Information, not money." Jude looked at her, and in that moment he understood something 20 years of building an empire had never taught him. Some people didn't need to be saved. They only needed directions. "Millennium Park, the southeast corner near Cloud Gate," he said. "Tourists, year-round. Not in the school's restricted zone. And the area manager's name is Harold. He owes me a favor from last year, but..." Jude paused and looked at Elise. "You call him and you talk to him yourself. I won't call for you." Elise looked at him, and for the first time since she'd met Jude Mercer, she nodded with something that wasn't just acceptance, but almost trust. April arrived with cherry blossoms opening along the shore of Lake Michigan, and the last cold breath of a Chicago winter finally pulled back and gave way to spring sun. Things were getting better. Oliver ate breakfast with his father every day. The eggs didn't burn anymore, even though they still weren't good, but the boy finished his plate and sometimes said, "Can you add more salt, Dad?" Like it was the most normal sentence in the world instead of a miracle. He talked to Phoebe every recess, sometimes letting out a small laugh when she drew a cat wrong and it turned into a bear. And the last time he went in for chemo, he held his arm out for the nurse, without needing his father to hold his hand. "Doctor, Henderson at Northwestern said the numbers were stabilizing. Not good yet, but stable. And with childhood leukemia, stable was good news." Then on Tuesday morning, in the 2nd week of April, Jude's phone rang at 10:15. Westbrook Academy. He answered and heard Mrs. Whitfield's voice. calm in the way people sound when they're trying not to panic. "Mr. Mercer," Oliver fainted in class. "An ambulance is on the way." Jude didn't remember what he said. He didn't remember leaving his meeting in the middle or knocking over a chair or anything at all. He only remembered Brennan driving the Escalade like it was cutting the wind in half, red lights streaking behind them like blurred lines. And when he reached Northwestern, Oliver was already on an emergency bed, white as the sheets, eyes closed, oxygen tubing at his nose, 3 IV lines in his arm. Dr. Henderson stood beside the bed, his face more serious than Jude had ever seen it. "His white count has spiked," Henderson said, holding the lab results. "Oliver's body is reacting against the current protocol. We need to switch to a stronger regimen, high-dose chemotherapy. The side effects will be much harsher, but this is our best chance to push the disease back." "What are the odds?" Jude asked, his voice flat in the way of a man using every ounce of strength not to break. 65% if we start within the next 24 hours. Wait longer and the odds drop every day. Do it. Mr. Mercer, I need you to understand the side effects. Vomiting, hair loss, severe immune suppression. Oliver will be in the hospital at least 3 weeks for the first round, and he needs willpower. Strong chemo isn't just medicine, it's a war, and the patient has to want to fight." "He'll fight," Jude said, but inside him the sentence didn't feel as certain as it sounded. 3 months ago his son hadn't wanted to live. He was better now. But was better enough? Was Oliver's newly lit desire to live strong enough to survive the most brutal regimen? Jude sat down in the chair beside Oliver's bed. He took his son's hand. The small hand was icy, old needle marks layered over new ones, skin so thin he could see blue veins underneath. He sat there. He didn't go anywhere, and he wasn't going anywhere. Then his phone vibrated. "Brennan." Jude looked at the screen and wanted to ignore it, but he saw the short message in Brennan's blunt style. "Urgent. Call me now." Jude stepped into the hallway, shut the hospital room door, and answered, "Talk." "Calloway," Brennan said, voice tight and fast. "Intel out of the Detroit line confirms it. He's coming to Chicago tonight. Alone. No security. Meeting a new partner at the South Harbor warehouse. Time, 11 tonight. We've got a 2-hour window. After that he flies out and we lose him. Maybe for good." Silence. Jude stood in the hospital corridor under cold white neon light, and in his head 2 worlds crashed into each other. Calloway. The man who killed Catherine. The man who forced her car into the barrier. Who turned Jude's son into a silent child carrying guilt that was never his. Who hollowed Jude's family out from the inside. Jude had waited 8 months for this chance. 8 months, while Brennan built an intelligence net, waiting for the one moment Calloway got careless. And that moment was tonight. Only tonight. But tonight his son was in a hospital bed, white as paper, his body betraying him, and the doctor had just said he needed willpower to fight. And that willpower needed his father beside him. 20 years ago, Jude wouldn't have needed to think. Calloway. Revenge. Finish it. Nothing mattered more. But 20 years ago, he had never sat on his son's bed reading a photo album. He had never heard his child ask, "Are you going to leave again?" He had never promised, "I'm here." "Brennan," Jude said, slow and clear, each word heavy as steel. "Cancel it." Silence on the other end. Brennan didn't argue. 15 years at Jude's side had taught him when his boss was decided. "My son is in the hospital," Jude added, not explaining it to Brennan, but to himself, to the part of him still screaming for revenge. "Calloway can wait. Oliver can't." He hung up, walked back into the room, sat down beside the bed, took his son's hand, and he stayed there. All night. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, changing fluids, taking temperatures. Brennan left coffee outside the door and disappeared again. The hallway lights dimmed as the hospital sank into night. Jude didn't sleep. He sat with his hand around Oliver's, eyes fixed on his son's chest, rising and falling, counting each breath as if he stopped counting, the breathing would stop too. 3 a.m. The hospital was utterly silent. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor and the night wind of Chicago hissing against the window. Oliver opened his eyes. Slowly, lids heavy. He turned his head to the right and saw his father, sitting there, holding his hand, dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, suit wrinkled, cold coffee on the table beside the bed, sitting there all night. "Dad?" Oliver's voice was hoarse and weak, but awake. "I'm here," Jude said, his voice hoarse too after 6 hours without speaking a word. "You're really here?" the boy asked. And inside that tiny question lived all 8 months of loneliness. All the nights holding his mother's picture by himself. All the mornings stepping out of the car while his father didn't say one more sentence. "You're really here" wasn't a question. It was a test. A child checking whether his father's promise was real, whether the world could be trusted, whether it was worth staying alive. "I'm here," Jude repeated, squeezing his son's hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Oliver looked at him for a long time. Then the boy nodded, slow and light, like the nod on the bed that night when his father held him for the first time. But this time he added one sentence. "Then I'm not going anywhere either." 7 words. 7 words Dr. Henderson couldn't prescribe on any chart. 7 words that meant Oliver Mercer, 8 years old, leukemia, who had once wanted to die, had just decided to live. Not because of medication, not because of doctors, but because at 3 in the morning, when he opened his eyes in a cold hospital room, his father was still there. And if his father was there, then he would be here too. Jude bowed his head, tightening his grip on his son's hand, his forehead touching the hospital bed rail, and he cried without sound. He had just given up the only chance he had to avenge Catherine, and he would never regret it. Oliver stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks. Jude was there every day, sleeping in the hospital chair, neck twisted, back aching, but never leaving. Elise brought Phoebe to visit every afternoon after selling balloons, the little girl carrying new drawings, taping them to the hospital wall until the blank white space turned into a 6-year-old's art gallery, all balloons, winged cats, and 2 tiny people holding hands under a blue sky. Oliver responded to the chemotherapy, slowly, painfully. But he responded, and when he was discharged in early May, most of his hair gone, his face puffy from the medication, but his white blood cell count finally moving in the right direction for the first time, Jude thought the hardest part was over. He was wrong. On the first Saturday night after Oliver came home, Jude left the house at 9 in the evening. Brennan drove him to the West Side warehouses, where Jude still had to handle loose ends before he could fully hand things off to his right hands. He was shrinking the empire, slowly and carefully, because walking away from the underworld wasn't like resigning from a company. There was no letter and no farewell party, only blood or lawyers, but that night a deal turned. A partner from the South delivered short, made excuses, and as the argument rose, both sides' men pulled knives. Jude stepped into the back alley behind the warehouse to settle it, and at that exact moment, Elise Dawson walked past. She shouldn't have been there, but her South Side studio was 2 blocks from that warehouse strip, and she was on her way home after a double shift, desperate to get back to Phoebe. To save 10 minutes, she decided to take a shortcut through the narrow alley, walking fast with her head down and her eyes straight ahead, ignoring the survival instinct that usually told her never to look into a dark place like this. But she heard Jude's voice. She recognized it instantly, low and slow, each word heavy as stone. Except it wasn't the voice he used with her. It wasn't the trembling father's voice on the stone bench beneath the oak tree. This was another voice, a command, a threat, a boss's voice. Elise stopped. Instinct told her to keep going, but her feet didn't listen. She looked into the alley, and she saw it. Jude stood in the middle of the alley, the streetlight cutting across half his face, the other half drowned in shadow. In front of him, a man knelt on the pavement, face bruised and bloodied, hands tied. Brennan stood behind Jude, holding something metallic. Elise didn't want to look at too closely, but she knew exactly what it was. Blood on the ground. Blood on Brennan's hands. And Jude stood there, calm and cold, saying words Elise couldn't make out, but she didn't need to, because the picture in front of her said everything. This was Jude Mercer's real world, not the father burning eggs at 6 in the morning, not the man whose hands shook when he talked about his son, not the man sitting all night beside a hospital bed holding Oliver's hand. This was the boss. Blood, darkness, violence, exactly what Dorothy had warned, exactly what had killed Catherine. Elise backed away. 1 step. 2. Then she turned and ran. She ran 2 blocks back to her studio, locked the door, pressed her back to the wall, breathing hard, and covered her face with both hands. The next morning, Elise didn't go to Millennium Park to sell balloons. Phoebe asked, "Mom, we're not going to sell today?" And Elise said, "Mom's tired." Phoebe didn't ask again. A 6-year-old who'd grown up with her mother's exhaustion knew when not to push. On the second day, Elise didn't go. On the third day, she didn't go either. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Jude's number. She didn't answer. She didn't reply to messages. She didn't open the door when Brennan knocked. She vanished. The first week, Phoebe cried every night because she missed Oliver. "Mom, why aren't we going to see Oliver? He just got out of the hospital." Elise held her daughter and didn't know how to answer. The second week, Brennan told Jude that Oliver asked about Phoebe every day. "Where's Phoebe, Dad? Why isn't she coming?" Jude listened, and he understood. He didn't call Elise again. He didn't send Brennan back to knock. He didn't use power or money or anything else to pull her back. Because Elise had taught him that actions spoke louder than words, and this time he was going to act. On the 10th day, Jude met Robert Shaw, the top white-collar attorney in Chicago, in an office on the 42nd floor of LaSalle Street. Jude put his entire business file on the desk, the legal and the illegal, everything. "I want to move it all to legitimate," he said. "Real estate, restaurants, transportation. Whatever can be kept, keep it. Whatever can't, sell it or shut it down." Shaw looked at him like he was insane. "You understand how long this takes and how much it costs?" "I'm not asking how long or how much. I'm telling you to do it." On the 12th day, Jude made a phone call that Brennan overheard from outside the door and nearly dropped his coffee. Jude called Special Agent Marcus Webb of the FBI, the man who'd been chasing the Calloway case for 4 years without enough evidence to indict. "I have everything you need," Jude said, calm. "The network, names, dates, witnesses. Proof Calloway ordered the hit on Catherine Mercer." Silence on the other end. "In exchange for what?" Webb asked. "Immunity for me, and witness protection for my family. You know what this means, Mercer. You're done in that world." "I'm already done." On the 14th day, Jude's phone rang. Elise's number. He answered, his hand steady, because he'd prepared for this call with actions instead of promises. "I'm coming back because of the kids," Elise said, her voice calm but tired. "Phoebe cries every night because she misses Oliver, and I don't have the right to let my fear cut my child off from her friend. But I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. No gaps." They met on a stone bench in Millennium Park late in the afternoon, when the tourists had thinned and Cloudgate reflected the purple-orange sky of a Chicago sunset. Jude told her everything, from the beginning, with no gaps, like Elise demanded. He told her about the empire his father left behind, about the 20 years he turned it into a monster that swallowed everyone he loved. He told her Catherine knew and stayed because she loved him. He told her about Calloway and the black SUV and the death sentence his world had signed in his wife's place. He told her about the night in the hospital when he gave up his one chance to take revenge on Calloway in order to sit beside Oliver. And he told her what he'd done in the 2 weeks Elise was gone, the lawyer Shaw, the FBI, the call with Webb, the decision to walk away from everything. Elise listened, silent, her face unreadable, her hands resting on her lap, calm, but Jude could see her fingers gripping the edge of her coat. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough for a flock of birds to sweep over Cloudgate and vanish past the horizon. "Did you kill people?" Elise asked, blunt. "Not directly," Jude said. "But I gave orders where the end result was no different from killing." He didn't dodge. He didn't justify. He didn't say, "I had to," or "the situation forced me." He told the truth, and he waited. "I don't forgive your past," Elise said, slow, choosing each word like she was laying bricks to build a wall. "That past has blood in it. People died. Catherine died. I can't look at that and say, it's fine, because it isn't. It's very much not fine." She turned to him, her eyes not cold, but not warm either, the eyes of someone protecting herself while trying to be fair. "But I respect the future you chose, lawyers, the FBI. Walking away from the empire. You didn't tell me those things to win me over, because you did them before you even knew whether I would come back." She paused, then added more softly, "That's the first time I've ever seen a man act first and speak second, instead of the other way around." Jude nodded. He didn't add anything. He'd learned that sometimes silence after the truth was worth more than any promise. And when they stood from the bench and walked in 2 different directions into the Chicago sunset, the distance between them was still there. But it was smaller than before. Much smaller, In July, Dr. Henderson asked Jude to step into a private room after Oliver's 12th chemotherapy infusion. Jude walked in braced for bad news. Because he was used to bad news. His life had been built out of bad news. But Henderson sat behind his desk with the lab results in his hand. And for the first time in nearly a year, he smiled. His white blood cell counts have been dropping steadily for 3 months. The cancer cells are retreating. Oliver's body is responding better than any of us predicted. Jude lowered himself into the chair, both hands on his thighs, and he felt his knees go weak in that strange way good news can cause, not relief exactly, but the moment the body finally realizes how much it's been carrying, and at last gives itself permission to shake. "I have to be honest," Henderson went on, his voice slowing as if he were weighing every word. "In 20 years of practice, I've never seen a patient's will change as fast as Oliver's. 3 months ago he refused to cooperate. Now he holds his arm out, counts down on his own, reminds the nurses when it's time for the infusion. Medication treats the disease, but will determines whether medication can work. And Oliver's will is very strong now." Jude knew where that will came from. It came from burned eggs at 6 in the morning, from a father's hand holding a son's hand in the infusion room, from the words, "I'm here at 3 in the morning in a hospital," and from the deflated red balloon Oliver brought to every infusion, tucked into his coat pocket, taped onto a piece of cardboard with corners worn down from being handled too much. A nurse asked what it was. Oliver answered, small but clear, "My friend gave it to me." He didn't explain more. He didn't need to. In September, Brennan knocked on the study door at 7 in the evening, his face unusual, not tense, but light, the kind of light Jude had never seen on his bodyguard's face in 15 years. "Calloway's been arrested," Brennan said. "The FBI hit at 5 this afternoon at the Detroit Harbor warehouse. Marcus Webb led it. He didn't get away. The whole network collapsed." Brennan set his phone on the desk. The screen showed a CBS Chicago report. Calloway in handcuffs being shoved into a federal vehicle, head down, hair wild, FBI agents in tactical vests surrounding him. Jude stared at the image for a long time. This was the face of the man who killed Catherine, the face Jude had once sworn he would erase from the world with his own hands. He had lost that chance on an April night when he chose to sit beside Oliver's hospital bed, instead of going to the South Harbor. And now Calloway wasn't ending by Jude's hand. He was ending by law, by the file Jude himself had delivered to the FBI. By a road Jude had never thought he would choose. Jude didn't feel triumph. He didn't smile. He didn't clench his fist. He simply pushed the phone back toward Brennan and said 2 words, his voice light, like a man setting down the last heavy thing on his shoulders. "It's over." Brennan nodded, took the phone, stepped out, and closed the door softly. And for the first time in 15 years, he knew his boss truly meant it. Over. Not paused. Over. In November, on a Sunday afternoon, Oliver was sitting on a hospital bed during his final chemotherapy session when the room door opened. Not Jude, not Elise or Phoebe. Dorothy Mercer walked in, her back still straight as steel, a small cloth bag in her hand, and on her face was an expression Oliver had never seen on his grandmother. Not stern, not cold, but something more fragile, something she'd hidden for 70 years. She pulled a chair up beside the bed and didn't speak for a moment, just looked at her grandson, at the head nearly shaved by chemo, at the needle marks on his arm, at the deflated red balloon taped to cardboard on the table by the bed. Then she opened the cloth bag and took out an old photo, yellowed with age. Catherine, 10 years old, standing in front of a house, grinning wide, missing 2 front teeth, holding an ice pop, a white dress stained with tomato sauce. "Your mother was mischievous when she was little," Dorothy said, her voice soft, light. Nothing like the voice she'd used when she faced Jude in her living room. One time she climbed the tree behind the house and tore her dress. Her grandmother scolded her, and your mother said, "Grandma, the tree invited me up." Her grandmother didn't even know what to say. Oliver stared at the photo. He stared at his mother at 10 years old, laughing, playful, alive. Not the mother in a memorial portrait, not the mother in his last memory slumped over a blood-streaked steering wheel. This was his mother as a child, when life still felt long and nobody knew it would end so early. "Tell me more," Oliver said, small. Dorothy looked at her grandson. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She didn't apologize for the complaint letter. She didn't say, "I was wrong." She simply sat there and told story after story about Catherine as a little girl, one sentence after another. until Oliver drifted off with the photo of his 10-year-old mother resting beside the deflated red balloon on the table, and that presence, without apology, without explanation, was enough. The day Oliver was discharged was the first day of March. Exactly 1 year after the afternoon, Phoebe slipped a red balloon through the iron fence at Westbrook Academy. Spring came early to Chicago that year, the sky so clean and blue it looked like someone had just washed it. Warm gold sunlight spilling across Lake Michigan, tulips blooming in clusters along the shoreline in red, yellow, and purple, as if the city knew someone needed to be welcomed home and decided to put on its prettiest clothes. Dr. Henderson stood at the doorway of the hospital room with the chart in his hands, smiling in the way he rarely smiled, smiling with his eyes. Stable numbers for 4 straight months. The cancer is in remission. Oliver still needs follow-ups every 3 months. But, he glanced at Jude, and then at Oliver pulling on his clothes on the bed. The boy gets to go home. Oliver walked out of the room on his own 2 feet. No wheelchair, no one holding him up. He was thinner than a year ago. Hair just starting to grow back and short and soft like down. But his eyes were different. Those eyes weren't empty anymore, weren't staring into nowhere searching for someone who was gone. Those eyes looked straight ahead, toward the end of the hospital corridor where Phoebe stood waiting, holding a brand new red balloon, perfectly round, blazing bright, just like the one she'd given him a year earlier through the fence. Oliver looked at the balloon. Then he looked at Phoebe. Then he smiled. Not almost smiled. Not a twitch of the mouth. A real smile. A smile that narrowed his eyes, that made a nearby nurse turn away to wipe tears, that made Jude behind him grab the wall because his knees went weak. The small party at Grant Park that afternoon wasn't anything grand. A plaid blanket spread on the grass near the lake. Sandwiches Jude made himself, cut a little crooked, filled a little too much, but made with his own hands. Orange juice in a thermos. A red balloon tied to the blanket corner, bobbing softly in the wind. Phoebe and Oliver sat side by side on the blanket, drawing. Phoebe drew Grant Park, the blue lake, tiny people on the grass, a sky full of balloons. Oliver held a crayon beside her and drew slowly, carefully, for the first time not drawing a wrecked car or a winged woman flying up into the sky. He drew 4 people standing on the grass, 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small, 1 smaller, all 4 holding hands. Elise sat on one corner of the blanket with her knees pulled up and her chin on her kneecaps, watching the children draw. Her hands were still cracked. Her coat was still pinned shut where the zipper had broken, but her eyes were different. A year ago, Elise Dawson's eyes were the eyes of a survivor. Always alert, always calculating, always braced for the worst. Now there was something in her gaze she'd forgotten the feel of. Peace. Jude sat across from her with his back against the trunk of a maple tree, watching the 3 of them. Then he slid his hand into his coat pocket. Elise. She looked up. He pulled out a key. Not a luxury car key or a mansion key, a plain brass key, old and slightly tarnished, on a simple key ring with no decoration. A house in Lincoln Park, Jude said, his voice slow and careful, like a man laying bricks on a wall he knows will collapse if he sets even one in the wrong place. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, 10 minutes on foot from Oliver's school, 15 minutes pushing a balloon cart to Millennium Park. Not a mansion, not a gift. He held Elise's gaze, and in his eyes was everything he'd learned in the past year, from burned eggs to 3 a.m. in a hospital, from an FBI phone call to a sunset on a bench in Millennium Park. It's a promise. In that house, nobody cries alone. Nobody skips meals so someone else can eat. Nobody pretends they're full. Nobody stays up until 11 at night studying on a bed because there's no desk. And nobody sells balloons in skin-cutting cold until their hands crack and bleed. Elise stared at the key, then at Jude. Her lips parted, her eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. Not because she was hard, but because she was trying to process something no one had given her in 6 years. Not money, not pity, but a promise spoken in actions first, and only then turned into words. Then Jude reached into his coat again. This time he took out a small box wrapped in deep navy velvet, old, worn at the corners, the kind of box that had been opened and closed across generations. He lifted the lid. Inside was a ring. Not a large diamond, not bright gold, but a thin platinum band set with a small sapphire the color of midnight. So simple that anyone who didn't know would think it was cheap, but it was Jude's grandmother's ring, the ring his grandfather gave her, when they had nothing but a one-room apartment on the South Side and a dream of building a new life in Chicago. Dorothy had placed it in Jude's hand that morning without many words, only saying, "Hold on to it properly this time." "Elise Dawson," Jude said, and his voice shook. It truly shook. The kind of shaking 15 years ruling Chicago's underworld couldn't train out of him, because this wasn't fear, this was love. "You taught me that presence matters more than power, that burned eggs are worth more than a perfect feast, that $3 can buy dinner or a miracle depending on who's holding it. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." Elise looked at the ring, looked at the key, looked at the man trembling in front of her, and she nodded, softly, but for real, the way she always made the biggest decisions of her life. Not loud, not dramatic, just a nod and a step forward. Jude slid the ring onto Elise's finger. His hands shook so much he almost dropped it. Her hands were cracked, nails short, skin rough from pumping balloons every day. The ring fit her ring finger perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her for 70 years. "Are you my dad?" Phoebe's voice cut in. She stood beside them, wide-eyed, looking up at Jude, still holding a blue crayon, jam from the sandwich still on her mouth. A simple question. Direct. Pure Phoebe. Jude knelt down, knees in the grass. His eyes came level with a 6-year-old who had given his son a red balloon, who had sat with his boy in the dark, who had said, "Real friends don't leave," when the whole world had walked away. "You taught me something no one taught me in 36 years, Jude said, his voice breaking, but the smile on his face still whole. "You taught me to look through a fence instead of building another one. You taught me that $3 can buy a balloon, but a heart is given for free." He opened his arms. "If you'll let me, I want to be your dad." Phoebe looked at Jude. Then she looked at her mother. Elise nodded, tears running but smiling. Phoebe turned back to Jude and launched herself into him, her small arms locking around his neck so tight Jude almost toppled backward on the grass. Oliver stood beside them, watching. Then he stepped forward, his small, thin hand touching Phoebe's back, then touching his father's shoulder. Then he leaned in, and Elise came closer and wrapped her arms around all three, and on the grass of Grant Park in the Chicago spring, 4 broken people from 2 different worlds held each other as one, while the red balloon tied to the blanket corner bobbed gently in the wind, like it wanted to rise into the sky but chose to stay. The wedding happened on a Saturday afternoon in mid-May, at Grant Park, in the exact stretch of grass by Lake Michigan where 4 months earlier 4 people had held each other for the first time as one family. There was no church, no castle, no crowd of hundreds in suits and evening gowns. There was only green grass, warm spring sunlight like liquid gold, a soft lake breeze carrying the scent of water and tulips blooming along the shore, and 30 folding chairs lined on both sides of a narrow aisle that Brennan and Oliver had laid with white fabric across the grass since early morning. 30 guests, not business partners, not politicians or lawyers or the faces that once knelt before the Mercer Empire, only the people who truly mattered. Dr. Henderson sat in the front row beside the oncology head nurse, who had held Oliver's hand through 12 rounds of chemotherapy. Mrs. Whitfield sat behind them, wearing a dress instead of a work suit for the first time, smiling in that rare way she almost never smiled in the principal's office. Harold, the Millennium Park manager, sat on the right corner, the cheerful old man who'd given Elise the best balloon-selling spot in the park for half a year without charging her extra. And Robert Shaw, the attorney, sat in the last row with a thick folder in his hands, the legal conversion paperwork 90% complete. Because even at a wedding, Shaw brought files. Oliver stood to the minister's right, back straight, hair newly grown and short and soft, wearing a white shirt that hung a little loose because he still hadn't gained all the weight back. But his eyes were bright, truly bright. In his hands was a small velvet pillow, with 2 rings resting on it. One the heirloom ring Jude's grandmother had given Elise, the other a new wedding band for Jude. Simple, plain, platinum, unengraved because Jude had said, "I don't need words carved into a ring. I need the person wearing it beside me." Phoebe stood at the start of the aisle, the smallest flower girl Grant Park had ever witnessed, dressed in a brand new white dress, the only dress she'd ever worn that wasn't a hand-me-down, feet in white shoes with little bows, no wool scarf wrapped around her ankles in place of socks, holding a small basket of white rose petals. She scattered the petals along the aisle with absolute seriousness, one petal at a time, placing each one carefully like a brick in a wall, because to Phoebe this wedding was building a home, a real home, with a dad. Elise appeared at the end of the aisle. No one walked her in. No father, no relatives. She walked alone, the way she'd walked alone for 6 years, through every slammed door, every skipped dinner, every night she cried by herself after Phoebe fell asleep. She walked on her own, shoulders squared, chin lifted, and this time she walked toward the person who was waiting. Her dress was simple, white, just past the knees, no long train, no complicated lace, because Elise had said, "I need the kind of dress I can still wear to the grocery store after the wedding." But she was beautiful. Beautiful in the way only someone who has lived through darkness becomes beautiful when she steps into the light. Jude stood at the front of the aisle watching Elise come closer, and he didn't hide his tears. Jude Mercer, the man the Chicago underworld once feared, stood crying in the middle of Grant Park in front of 30 people because a balloon seller who charged $2 a balloon was walking toward him. Brennan stood behind him and cried too, even though he'd deny it until the day he died. When Elise reached the front, a hand reached up and took hers from the first row. Dorothy Mercer. She stood, spine straight, eyes shining, held Elise's hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Hold on to him tight, sweetheart," Dorothy said softly, only loud enough for Elise to hear. "He's stubborn, but he knows how to love. Hold on tight." Elise looked at Dorothy, the woman who had signed the complaint that banned her balloon cart, the woman who had run a background check on her, the woman who'd confronted her own son because she was terrified of Catherine's tragedy repeating, and also the woman who had handed Jude his grandmother's ring, who had brought a photo of Catherine as a child to the hospital and told Oliver stories, who had sat beside her grandson's bed on a Sunday afternoon without needing to say sorry because her presence was the apology. "I will," Elise said. Then she stepped forward. The minister offered the blessing. Oliver presented the rings. Jude slid the ring onto Elise's finger, and this time his hand didn't shake. Elise slid the ring onto Jude's finger, and her hand didn't shake either. The 30 guests rose and applauded when the two of them kissed for the first time as husband and wife, there in Grant Park under the Chicago spring sun, and Phoebe shouted, "Mom, you've got a husband now," so loudly across the grass that all 30 people burst into laughter. Then came the moment Oliver had been waiting for all day. Behind the chairs, Brennan pulled back a tarp, and underneath it were hundreds of red balloons tied into one massive cluster, bobbing in the Lake Michigan wind. Bright red, overflowing, like the balloon Phoebe had given Oliver through the fence 1 year ago, multiplied by the hundreds. Everyone took one. Oliver held his, but before he released it, he pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, folded into quarters, and tied it to the balloon string with the knot Phoebe had taught him. Jude looked at his son. Oliver looked up at his father, eyes wet but smiling. "For Mom," he said. Jude nodded. He didn't ask what was written. He didn't need to. The minister counted down. 3, 2, 1. Hundreds of red balloons rose into the Chicago sky all at once, a blazing red cloud lifting from green grass, drifting over Lake Michigan, sailing past the horizon, climbing into the clear blue spring air. 30 people tipped their heads back to watch. Phoebe clapped, eyes shining. Elise rested her head on Jude's shoulder. Dorothy stood perfectly still, gaze lifted, fingers curled tight around the back of a chair, and Oliver stood in the middle of the grass, looking up as his balloon carried that small folded note higher and higher, smaller and smaller among the sea of red, until it became a single red dot against the blue. On that note, in the handwriting of a 9-year-old boy, no longer shaky and slanted like the drawings hidden under the bed, but straight, clear, steady, each word carefully formed, it said, "I love you, Mom. It wasn't my fault, but I'll be okay." The lake wind strengthened and carried the red balloons farther from Grant Park, beyond the city's horizon, thinning into the afternoon sky. Jude stood beside Elise, hand in hers, watching them go. "You know," he said softly, peaceful in a way he'd never been in 36 years, "it all started with one question." Elise smiled. "Sir, why doesn't your son play with anyone?" "That question broke me," Jude said. "Then it rebuilt me." Elise squeezed his hand, and on the grass of Grant Park, in the Chicago spring, a new family began. Not perfect, not dripping with wealth, not a fairy tale, just a man who once ruled the dark, learning how to step into the light. A woman who once skipped meals so her child wouldn't go hungry, learning how to accept love without losing her dignity. a boy who once wanted to die learning how to want to live, and a little girl who once wrapped a wool scarf around her ankles instead of socks and gave away a $3 balloon because she believed someone needed it more than she did. 2 broken families. 1 new family. Beginning with a 6-year-old's question from outside a fence. Their story reminds us that sometimes miracles don't come from money or power. They come from presence, from one hand taking another, from the words, "I'm here" at 3 a.m, from burned eggs cooked with clumsy love, and from a $3 red balloon a poor child was willing to go without dinner to give to a boy she'd never truly met. Life sometimes places us on opposite sides of fences, inside or outside, rich or poor, strong or fragile. But what matters most isn't where we stand, it's whether we dare to look through the fence and truly see the pain of the person on the other side. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to say, "I'm here." And it's never too late to look through the fence. Subscribe to our channel to hear more moving stories every day. And we'd truly love to hear what you felt deep in your heart, what this story brought up for you, whether it made you think of someone in your real life. So please share in the comments below so we can listen to you. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.